Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching vSphere 5.1 Distributed Switch Improvements. Before I walk you through step by step how to configure some of the new vSphere Distributed Switch improvements, let me first give you a features overview. We'll cover all the new features related to the vSphere 5.1 Distributed Virtual Switch. So with that, let's get started. The first VDS feature in vSphere 5.1 I want to talk about is the network health check. When you configure a new vSphere distributed switch, it's really a two-step process where you first have to configure the physical network switches that the vSphere host is connected to, and then configure the vSphere distributed switch. Well, there's some cases where key information like the VLAN configuration, teaming, or MTU that absolutely must be configured properly is not. And then when you configure the vSphere distributed switch, you're left in a troubleshooting scenario between the physical network configuration and the virtual network configuration. Well, new in vSphere 5.1, they've introduced the network health check, which is a tool that's going to monitor at regular intervals the VLAN, the MTU, and the network adapter teaming configurations to ensure that everything's configured properly on the physical and the virtual network. The default interval for performing this configuration check or this monitoring is every 1 minute, but that's something, of course, you can tweak for yourself. How it works is layer 2 Ethernet probing packets are sent and received across the physical uplink interfaces of the VDS, and if those packets aren't properly received, then you know that you've got a problem, and the network health check monitoring is going to alert you. I'll show you later in this lesson how to configure the new vSphere 5.1 distributed switch network health check. The next feature I want to talk about is the VDS configuration, backup, and restore. As you probably know, virtual network configurations are stored in VMware vCenter, and that applies also to distributed switch configurations. But vSphere distributed switch configurations can become very complex and be very difficult to replicate. So let's say that you lost a vCenter database and were unable to restore it. It could be very difficult to recreate your distributed switch configuration. So thankfully, VMware has included with vSphere 5.1 the VDS configuration backup and restore feature that takes a snapshot of the VDS configuration as well as the port level configurations. And the cool thing about this is that you can use those backups like templates to recreate new vSphere distributed switches based on a backup of a existing vSphere distributed switch. You can save the VDS backup data locally, or you could put it out on your storage area network, and from there you could restore it to an existing switch or create a new switch from the backup. You can also use that backup data to immediately restore a port group. If, let's say, that you've made some configuration changes, you weren't quite sure what you did and things aren't working, you can just very quickly roll back to the previous backup. So again, VDS configuration backup and restore is something I'll be demonstrating for you in just a little bit. Another new feature is the VDS management network rollback and recovery. Now, in vSphere standard switching environments, you can recover really easily from a management network failure by going to the direct console user interface or the DCUI and then just say you want the management network to be put back and connected to a physical network adapter that's up and working. But in a vSphere distributed switch environment, you've got multiple hosts connected to a distributed switch, and it's much easier for a failure or a misconfiguration to take down the management port group that would then affect all hosts in the vCenter server. Previously in vSphere 5.0, the only way to get a host management network back is to just go back and put the management network on a standard switch and reconnect it from there, and you'd have to do that to every host. But with vSphere 5.1, the management network rollback and recovery allows you to automatically roll back or recover the management network on a vSphere distributed switch. And the cool thing about it is that it's really automatic. It will detect a configuration change on the management network, and if it can't reach the vCenter server, it'll just automatically put that distributed switch configuration back to where it was before. Additionally, you have the option to reconfigure the management network of the vSphere distributed switch now through the direct console user interface on the console of a ESXi host. The next feature that's new in vSphere 5.1 is the Distributed Port Auto Expand. And how it works in vSphere 5.1 is if you choose a static port binding on your distributed switch, the auto expand feature is going to be enabled by default. What this means is that you don't have to worry about running out of switch ports on your distributed virtual switch inside your port groups. You should also note that dynamic bindings are now deprecated, as VMware calls it, which means essentially discontinued. They won't be in future vSphere versions, and ephemeral bindings are now no longer possible in vSphere 5.1. So when you go to create a new vSphere distributed switch now, check out the different types of port binding options, and I think that you'll see static binding with the auto expand option is going to be the default and the way to go. Next new feature on the list is MAC address management. As you probably know, it's the vCenter server that manages and allocates Ethernet MAC addresses for your virtual machine's Ethernet adapters. To make this process easier and more scalable in vSphere 5.1, now there's support for locally administering Ethernet MAC addresses on your vCenter server. For better or for worse, VMware admins now have control over all 48 bits of an Ethernet MAC address for a virtual machine. Last on the list is the Link Aggregation Control Protocol support. So new with vSphere 5.1, support is provided for LACP, which is a standard method, not a VMware method, for aggregating multiple physical network links together to form a single logical channel. So if you're familiar with Cisco's Ether channel, LACP is the open standard method or open standard protocol for doing something very similar. I'm thankful that VMware has provided support for LACP. I think both network admins and VMware admins will welcome the ability of an ESXi host or a vSphere host to fully bond multiple network channels together using the standards-based protocol. Now let's talk about VMware distributed switch improvements in terms of scalability with vSphere 5.1. So now with vSphere 5.1, you can go up to 128 vSphere distributed switches per vCenter server. You can have up to 10,000 static port groups per vCenter server, up to 60,000 distributed ports per vCenter server, and up to 500 hosts per vSphere distributed switch. So there's some massive scalability improvements in vSphere 5.1 related to vSphere distributed switches. Moving on, let's talk about some more improvements related to vSphere 5.1 distributed switches before we jump into our hands-on step-by-step section in just a minute. So stick with me. Just a few more improvements here you need to know about. The first one is the BPDU filter, or the Bridge Protocol Data Unit Filter. Now, for those of you who don't know what BPDUs are, these are actually the packets that physical switches exchange as part of the spanning tree process to discover the network topology. Now, vSphere distributed switches and standard switches don't participate in that STP process and thus don't send or receive BPDUs. However, let's say that you did something inside a virtual machine, like configured a virtual switch that did send BPDUs. You could actually cause a denial of service attack or downtime in the virtual infrastructure's network. To prevent this, new in vSphere 5.1, vSphere can actually filter BPDUs that originate from virtual machines running inside vSphere. Now today, this isn't something that you'll see in the GUI. This is actually a kernel parameter that you must configure using the net settings on each of your ESXi hosts. However, it's an important security feature that you need to know about, especially if, let's say, you're a service provider or you don't have total control of all the virtual machines that you create in your virtual infrastructure. The next feature on the list is the support for NetFlow 10. New in vSphere 5.1, NetFlow version 10 is supported. That's really the latest release of NetFlow, which supports IP version 6, MPLS, VXLAN, and other features. Also, there's a number of new SNMP enhancements in vSphere 5.1. Previously, ESXi could run an SNMP agent, but there's a new agent in vSphere 5.1 that has additional support for SNMP version 3, which offers better security. As part of this SNMP enhancement, there's a new SNMP MIB that offers additional SNMP statistics such as per virtual switch, port up and port down state information, traffic counters per VLAN port, and much more to aid in the monitoring and troubleshooting of the virtual network. Next up is SRIOV, or Single Root I/O Virtualization. This is actually a standard that enables a single PCIe or PCI Express adapter to be presented as separate logical devices to a virtual machine. So the virtual machine can talk directly to the PCIe adapter. This isn't something that most virtual machines will be configured with. Instead, this is something for what I would say are very high performance virtual machines that demand the least amount of latency in accessing that PCIe adapter. This is similar to VMware's VM Direct Path, but VM Direct Path was not an open standard. SRIOV is a standard, and it's going to help those types of virtual machines that really need, let's say, high-speed access to perhaps a 10 gig Ethernet adapter or a fiber channel HBA. Just keep in mind that, like VM Direct Path, if you choose to use SRIOV on a particular virtual machine, it's not going to be vMotion compatible, VMware fault tolerance compatible, or vSphere high availability compatible while SRIOV is enabled. And then the last new feature related to vSphere 5.1 that I want to talk about is related to port mirroring, specifically RSPAN and ERSPAN. And I've got a couple graphics here to help us visualize this. The first one shows RSPAN. Now, both RSPAN and ERSPAN are going to enable you to perform additional network monitoring and troubleshooting much easier than you ever could before. These are open standards. Now, network port mirroring was first released in vSphere 5, but new in vSphere 5.1, with RSPAN and ERSPAN, you can actually monitor the virtual network multiple hops away. So with RSPAN, what you can do is first you dedicate a VLAN for the RSPAN session, and then you can use port mirroring to capture all the traffic flowing across that VLAN, trunk it on the physical adapter of the vSphere host, and then send it across the physical network. Of course, your switches also have to be properly configured to send this traffic to some sort of port analyzer or monitoring station where you can analyze the traffic going across the VLAN on a particular vSphere distributed switch. Now, ERSPAN is very similar to RSPAN. RSPAN actually stands for Remote Switch Port Analyzer, so that's what you're doing. You're taking a switch port, or an entire VLAN in this case, and sending it, in this case, to a remote monitoring station. ERSPAN just stands for Encapsulated Remote Switch Port Analyzer. So with ERSPAN, you're actually encapsulating this VLAN traffic, and then you're able to send it across an IP network. This is made possible by a GRE tunnel that's connecting the two. So both of these are for remote port mirroring, for monitoring the virtual network. What you need to know is that these additional capabilities give you a lot more options for getting that traffic off of a vSphere distributed switch, off of the virtual network, through the physical network, whether it has to be tunneled or it's just going from one switch to another switch to your workstation, and then eventually into a monitoring station, such as a Network General Sniffer application that's going to decode those packets, analyze the network traffic, and help you to solve some networking problem or perform some sort of troubleshooting on a network-based application, which almost every application is today. These new improvements related to port mirroring using RSPAN and ERSPAN are so much better than ever in the past. If you had to analyze virtual network traffic inside the vSphere virtual network, you would have to create a virtual machine and run a packet analyzer actually inside the virtual machine on the virtual network. So you've got so many more options today. I really applaud these new improvements. Now it's time for our hands-on section. I'd like to go over to our vSphere lab at the Wired Brain Coffee Company and walk you through enabling the new vSphere 5.1 distributed switch network health check feature. Here we are in the new vSphere web client. Let's first create a vSphere distributed switch in the web client, as it's something you may not have done before, and it gets us up to where we need to be to demonstrate the new vSphere 5.1 health check feature. So if we go into networking, and then if we go up to the actions drop down here, I can go down and click here to create a new distributed switch. This brings up the new distributed switch wizard, which may look very similar to the vSphere client for Windows. So first we'll give our distributed switch a name. Let's just call this development 1. Click next here. And then there's something that's slightly different here, of course, the version of the vSphere distributed switch. So notice how the versions of the vSphere distributed switch have increased over time, and the latest version, now with vSphere 5.1, is, you guessed it, distributed switch 5.1. So it says this version is compatible with VMware ESXi version 5.1 and later, and has the new features that I just got done talking about, things like management network rollback and recovery, health check, enhanced port mirroring, and LACP. So that's the type of switch that we're going to create. If you have other existing distributed virtual switches, you're going to want to upgrade those at some point in the upgrade process, and I'll talk about that in another lesson. Let's just click next here, and we can specify the number of uplinks, network I/O control, default port group. We do want to create a default port group. We'll call this development 1 port group 1, and just take the defaults. I'll click next here. I do like the suggested next actions here. Create a new distributed port group and add and manage hosts. I'll click finish. And there's our new distributed virtual switch. I'll go ahead and expand that out. You can see that the development port group was created here, and we've got our uplinks as well. So if I click on the port group, let's go ahead and right click on that and go down to edit settings. And let's just look at some of the settings here on the port group. If we go in here and edit the settings, notice the port binding here is static by default, and also it's elastic by default. That's something we talked about. Of course, you can also go in here and enable things like NetFlow. We talked about there being a new version of NetFlow. But that's about all that's new here on the port group configuration. If we right-click on the uplinks and edit the settings on the uplinks, notice there's a new section down here for LACP. It's here that I can enable LACP. That's the link aggregation control protocol we talked about for binding multiple uplinks together. Of course, there's also NetFlow configuration here, and that's about all we need to see on the uplink port group. And at this point, let's get on with configuring the network health check, the new feature I wanted to show you in the vSphere 5.1 distributed switch. So to do it, I'm just going to go up here and click on our virtual distributed switch. And notice over here on the right-hand side, we get a list of the features that are supported. There's the new LACP, and also here's the new health check that we're about to configure. This doesn't mean that these are actually configured or enabled. It just means that they are indeed supported. So to configure health check, I'm going to go into Manage, and then notice here on the Settings section, if we scroll down, here's the health check configuration. Currently, VLAN and MTU health checks are disabled, and the teaming and failover health checks are also disabled. Those are the defaults. I'll click Edit here, and it's really very simple. All you need to do here is just to enable whichever one of the health checks that you intend to use. I'll say OK here, and just to briefly tell you a little bit about these while they're being configured. Of course, the purpose of the health checks are to look for mismatched VLAN trunks between the vSphere distributed switch and physical switch, mismatched MTU settings between the physical network adapters, the distributed switches, and the physical switch ports, and then the mismatched virtual switch teaming policies that could occur for the physical switch port channel settings. So now that these are enabled, what's going to happen is that vSphere 5.1 is going to monitor whether or not our VLAN switch settings match the trunk port configuration on the adjacent switch ports, check whether or not MTU settings match and our network adapter teaming configuration is consistent between the physical switch ether channel configuration and the distributed virtual switch port teaming policy configuration. So with these enabled, how do you actually monitor to see the status or the health of the virtual switch? If I go over here to Monitor, I can then go into the Health section, and notice here that the network health check is configured for VLAN and MTU, and also for teaming and failover. That's what we just did. And it says the overall health here is normal. Awesome. Everything looks good here. But what's missing? Well, there aren't any hosts on the list here. That's because there aren't any hosts that have been added to this virtual distributed switch. Let's go ahead and add a vSphere host to this virtual distributed switch. I'll go up here to Actions and down to Add and Manage Hosts. We can click Add New Host to the distributed switch here. I'll click here to add a host. I'll just select one of the hosts for now. It says the status is connected. Click Next. We'll go ahead and migrate one of these adapters to. We get a warning here that our VMK0, our management network, might lose network connectivity if we don't migrate it to the distributed virtual switch. I do know that the vSwitch that it's on still has other uplinks, so we really don't have to worry about that. I can click Next here. It says the validation has passed. Everything looks good. Right now, I'm not going to migrate any virtual machine networking. We'll just click Next and Finish. And we now have an ESX host on this virtual distributed switch. It does say the VLAN health status is unknown. And there's not a lot of information for MTU and teaming either. That's because I'll just tell you, in this lab environment, VLANs currently are not in use, and I don't have any teaming or failover configuration in place either. But if I did, the virtual distributed switch health check feature that's new in vSphere 5.1 would alert us to any problems with those types of configurations and potentially prevent major outages for the applications running on critical virtual machines that are utilizing this virtual distributed switch. Now let's move on and talk about another new feature in vSphere 5.1, and that is the backup and recovery of vSphere distributed switches. In vSphere 5.1, VMware has made it easy to back up the configuration of a distributed switch and the distributed port groups, and then use that backup file to either restore that switch and its port groups back to their previous state, or to even create a new distributed virtual switch and port groups, if you choose to, from that backup file, effectively cloning the distributed virtual switch and its port groups. So let me show you how to do it. It's actually really easy. I've got a distributed virtual switch here. I'll just right-click on this, go down to All vCenter Actions, and then down to Export Configuration. Notice the other option here is Restore Configuration. So you can think of export as backup. It's the same thing. You're taking the configuration of this distributed virtual switch and its port groups and putting those in a configuration file on your local computer. So I'll click here to export the configuration. It says, do you want to export the entire distributed switch and all of its port groups, or just the distributed virtual switch only? In my case, I'm going to back up or export the distributed switch and all the port groups, and also give this backup a description or comment down here, so I can say, here's the config of our development virtual distributed switch as of a certain date, so XXXX. So whatever date that is, I'll say OK here. It says, please wait, we're exporting the configuration, and it says the distributed switch configuration was exported successfully. Do you want to save this exported file locally on your computer? I'll say yes. And then I just need to give this a name here, and we can just give it the same name as the comment, really. Config of our development VDS as of a certain date. I'll say save. And there we go. We just exported the configuration. Now, let's say that a junior admin went in here and made some configuration changes. Maybe he accidentally right-clicked on the port group here, and then he clicked Remove from Inventory. Uh-oh, that port group is gone. Some servers are having some major problems. End users are complaining. There was a lot of configurations that might have been made to that over time, not really sure. So how do we get that back to where it was before? Well, it's easy. With vSphere 5.1, you just right-click, go down to All vCenter Actions. I'll click on Restore the Configuration. I'll say I want to restore the distributed switch and all of its port groups, not just the switch only. I'll select the file by browsing. Here's the file that we exported. I'll say open. Click next here. We're ready to complete. I'll click finish. We see something change there. I'll expand this. And there we go. Our development port group is back where it needs to be. Now I can effectively use that same export file to create a new virtual distributed switch and port groups with the exact same configuration. I can't actually create the switch. I actually have to create the switch up here. I'll say new distributed switch. And I'll just take all the defaults here and click finish, because as soon as that's created, I'm going to then just right click on it, and I'm going to go to all vCenter actions and say that I want to restore the configuration. So I can restore, again, just the switch only or the switch and port groups. I'll choose port groups. I'll click browse. I'll select the configuration file that we exported. Say OK. Click next. And it gives us a warning here. You're about to restore from an exported configuration from a different switch, which will effectively reconfigure this new switch we created to look and be configured just as the other switch is. I'll say finish here. We get a refresh. I'll expand this out. And notice the names of the port groups. We've got a new uplink port group. We've got a development port group. And we do have a little overlap here, a little cleanup we need to do. This uplinks port group actually isn't going to work because we've already got an uplinks port group down here. So what we can do is just delete this out, remove from inventory right here. And we really don't need this other port group that was already added by default when we created the virtual distributed switch. So I'll delete that as well. Now notice we've got the same port group configuration. We've got the same distributed switch configuration. I can just right click on this and rename it, and I'll call it development 2. And then right click and rename this port group, call it development 2 port group 1. Say OK there. And of course I could also rename the uplinks if we chose to do that as well. And there, now we have total consistency between the two virtual distributed switches, and we know that the configuration of these switches is exactly the same. So that's one of the cool new features of vSphere 5.1 as it relates to distributed virtual switches. And with that, we'll go back to our slides. And now I'd like to thank you for watching this lesson on what's new in vSphere 5.1 related to virtual networking and specifically vSphere distributed switches. There's a lot of exciting new networking features in vSphere 5.1. I hope you'll check them out for yourself and try them out in your own lab. Thanks for watching.